He rides his black steed through the countryside, and whenever he stops, a mortal man dies. He's the angel of death and worthy of dread, dressed all in black and lacking a head. In his left hand is a spine that he'll use as a whip. In his right hand, a scythe that will cut to the quick. This year marks the 203rd anniversary of a Halloween favorite, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. But did you know that the Headless Horseman was actually based on an Irish myth? I didn't. It's based on the Dullahan, and it's a headless rider who, along with his horse, hunts the souls of the living at night. The legend of Sleepy Hollow was written by Washington Irving, and it's set in 1790, but in 1776, German soldiers who served as auxiliaries or mercenaries assisted the British Redcoats. They were hired by King George III to fight the Americans. While staying in Tarrytown, which is what Sleepy Hollow was called back then, Irving may have heard stories about a Hessian soldier whose headless body was found nearby during the war. His head was decapitated by a cannonball at the Battle of White Plains. The Hessian was 24 years old, and his name was Heinrich. John Hancock, one of the founding fathers, wrote that the Hessians fought without remorse or compunction. There was a soldier who survived the Battle of White Plains that wrote in his diary that the Hessians took 3 of our men and killed them immediately, as is their custom. New Yorkers believed at the time that the Hessians would capture and eat their children, so when Washington Irving decided to make his Headless Horseman a Hessian, he was tapping into the village's terrifying yet very true local history. So what exactly is a Dullahan? In general, it's an evil headless spirit and one of the scariest figures in Irish mythology. It may be depicted as a headless horseman on a black horse who carries his head in his hand or under his arm, but he may not have his head at all. The horseman wears a long black cloak that flows behind him as he rides. His eyes are said to be lit by a hellish fire, and they dart back and forth, constantly looking for victims. His mouth is split into a terrifying grin, while the flesh on his head looks moldy and like it's about to slough off of the skull. His black horse is darker than night and is often headless as well. But if it has its head, its eyes are also flaming red. The horseman is sometimes known to ride a black carriage that is known as the death coach or the silent coach, that's made of coffins, tombstones, and bones, and it's pulled by 4 to 6 black horses. The horses and the coach move so quickly that the shrubbery on the side of the road catches on fire. It's wise to have some gold on you if you're in his domain, because the Dullahan has an irrational fear of gold. But this will only work if you're not the one that he's after. The Dullahan can speak, but only once per journey, and the only thing that he will say is the name of the person whose soul he is there to collect. As the Dullahan rides through the villages after dark, people will hide behind their curtains because if anyone looks at him, they are immediately blinded, or they may have buckets of blood splashed in their face. He blinds you by cracking his whip in your face, and the whip is made from the vertebrae of a human spine. The exact origin of the legend isn't known, but the Dullahan are thought to be the embodiment of the Celtic fertility god, Crom Duv or Black Crom, an evil deity that was involved in human sacrifice in ancient times. He's often compared to the Grim Reaper, and he was Ireland's last pagan god when the Christians first arrived in the 6th century. Crom Duv was worshipped by a king who ruled Ireland about 1500 years ago. Being that he was the god of fertility, after these sacrifices were made via decapitation, the village would have a bountiful harvest and plenty of healthy cattle. But eventually, with the arrival of the Christians, human sacrifice ceased. So Crom Duv, being deprived of his offerings, decided to take matters into his own hands. He took on the form of a headless horseman, and he began to claim the lives that he believed he was denied. He became the embodiment of death itself. Crom Duv gave the Dullahan many gifts. Some of those gifts were supernatural sight and the ability to see for miles or pass through any locked gate or door. He could also see through walls, and while he was riding, he holds his severed head high, which lets him see over the vast countryside, even in pitch dark, and also into the houses of the dying. Some villagers have claimed to have encountered the Dullahan on his way to claim a soul. If you see the horseman, he will take your soul as well as the soul that he was there to take in the first place. Writer W.J. Fitzpatrick claimed that he encountered the Dullahan, and this is what he said. "I seen the Dullahan myself, stopping on the brow of the hill between Briersford and Moneyscout late one evening, just as the sun was setting. It was completely headless, but it held up its own head in its hand, and I heard it call out a name. I put my hand across my ears in case the name was my own, so I couldn't hear what it said. When I looked again, it was gone, but shortly afterwards there was a bad car accident on that very hill, and a young man was killed. It had been his name that the Dullahan was calling." Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is that the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual revelry. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs or subject to chances and visions, and frequently see strange sights in music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood with tail spots and twilight superstitions. The short story about the infamous decapitated equestrian was originally published in February 1820 as one of a series of stories that included Rip Van Winkle. It was later collected as the sketchbook. The legend of Sleepy Hollow is considered one of America's first ghost stories, as well as one of its scariest. But the Headless Horseman isn't the only legend in or around Sleepy Hollow. There's the Spook Rock, the haunted Octagon House, the mystery of the woman in black, UFO sightings, and Hulda, the Witch of Bohemia, which was a woman who was originally shunned in Sleepy Hollow for being a witch, but she later became a Revolutionary War hero, just to name a few. In 1996, North Tarrytown was renamed Sleepy Hollow to reconnect with its famous past, and today, like Salem, Massachusetts, it's a very popular Halloween tourist attraction. Around 100,000 people visit Sleepy Hollow in October. Because there are multiple adaptations of this story, the party at the Van Tassels was referred to originally as a quilting frolic, but somehow it became a Halloween party in other adaptations. Quilting frolics were quilting parties where women would come together to work on one large quilt. They had a lot of food, all types of cakes and pies, and just anything that you could possibly imagine. The Old Dutch Church was founded around 1685, and it's the church in the short story. It's also often confused with the nearby Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The Old Dutch Church's cemetery is also the supposed haunt of the Headless Horseman, and it's also where some of the local citizens who likely inspired some of Irving's characters are resting in peace. The character, Ichabod Crane, was named after an Army officer that Irving met in 1814 in Sackett's Harbor, New York. But after the story was published, the officer wasn't too happy about being associated with such a character. Samuel Youngs also inspired Ichabod Crane's character. He was a school teacher and a friend of Washington Irving's. Ichabod's mannerisms and his behavior were inspired by a different friend, a teacher named Jesse Merwin, and he was from Kinderhook, New York. Eleanor Van Tassel Brush is believed to be the inspiration for the character Katrina, and Abraham Martland is said to have inspired the Brom Bones character, and they are both buried here. The Hessian Headless Horseman was also buried in the cemetery, according to Irving. There is an unmarked grave in the northeast corner of the cemetery where he's buried, and according to legend, every night the horseman tethers his horse to graves in the cemetery until it's time to ride and search for his missing head. The bridge that inspired Irving and where the Headless Horseman threw his head at Ichabod no longer exists. This bridge is more of a replica, and it's on the property of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. For those who haven't heard the story or don't remember, there's a school teacher named Ichabod Crane, and he's from Connecticut. He's a man of letters, and he is described as tall and skinny like a crane with a small head that's flat on the top. He has big ears, large green eyes, a long nose, and an inflated sense of self. He doesn't look anything like Johnny Depp or this guy from the TV show Sleepy Hollow. I think that Don Knotts would have made a great Ichabod. Anyway, Ichabod is very superstitious, and he believes in everything supernatural, including the legend of the Headless Horseman. Ichabod is interested in the beautiful and rich Katrina von Tassel, but he's not the only one. There's also the strong, broad-shouldered, and handsome hero, Brom Bones, and he also wants to marry Katrina. Ichabod decides to give Katrina private singing lessons so that he can spend some alone time with her. Brom comes up with a plan to train a dog that he found to whine whenever Ichabod sings, and then he gives it to Katrina as a gift. In the short story, it's written that Ichabod would delight listeners equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and of the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air, which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the fact that the world did absolutely turn around and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. He's like a traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. It is also said that another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along with the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Further on he beheld great fields of Indian corn with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies, infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual were doling out their wild and wonderful legend. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was also made of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief parts of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The story of old Brower was also told. Brower didn't believe in ghosts until he met the horseman on his way back from Sleepy Hollow. They started racing each other until they reached the bridge, and the horseman turned into a skeleton and threw Brower into the stream. Brom Bones claimed that he raced the horseman once, and that he and his horse, named Daredevil, would have won if the horseman hadn't vanished in a flash of fire at the last minute. Because of the creepy stories that were told at the party, Ichabod is on edge as he rides home. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all of the other trees of the neighborhood, and it formed a kind of a landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary tree, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's Tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle, and he thought that his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the tree branch. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning and the white wood laid bare. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream, and on that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeoman concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge with a suddenness that nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and it stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now gotten over his fright and waywardness. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless, but his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation, and he rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road, which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, instead of keeping up with it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads to a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in the Goblin story, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had gotten halfway through the hollow, girths of the saddle gave way and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I'm safe. But just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him, and he even fancied that he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs and old gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind him to see if his pursuer should vanish according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then, he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but it was too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash, and he tumbled headlong into the dust, and gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, Ichabod was absent from his classroom, and his horse was found without his saddle. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard and at the bridge and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower and Bones and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. An old farmer who had visited New York several years after said that Ichabod was still alive and that he had left the town partly through fear of the Headless Horseman and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification of having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, and that he had moved to a different part of the country, became a lawyer, and later a politician. Brom and Katrina were married, and whenever Brom heard the story of Ichabod and the pumpkin, he would just laugh. This led many to believe that he knew more about that night than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church from the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghosts of the unfortunate pedagogue, and the plowboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of sleepy